Hello everyone, my name is Pierre Fastrez.
And I am Denise Sutter. Our presentation is entitled Assessing Media and Information Literacy, Teenagers' Practices and Competence in Information Search and Multimedia Creation.
In this presentation, we introduce the research framework and first results of the LM-ADO research project. LM-ADO is an international research program involving 4 French-speaking universities. This project seeks to develop and validate tools for assessing the media and information literacy competence levels of students in information search and multimedia creation. These levels are assessed in lower secondary schools in the 4 participating regions: French-speaking Belgium, Quebec in Canada, Normandy in France, and the canton of Geneva in Switzerland. The data presented in this paper will focus on Belgium and Switzerland. While our work is grounded in the media literacy tradition, we recognize the convergence of media literacy and information literacy into media and information literacy, or MIL, as largely relevant to the project presented in this paper. Both media literacy and information literacy traditions include diverging views on literacy. On the one hand, cognitive approaches consider literacy as knowledge and skills that individuals must master independently of the context in which they use them. These approaches seek to develop standardized quantitative measurements of these knowledge and skills. On the other hand, critical cultural approaches question the very relevance of these assessments and favor qualitative, thick descriptions of culturally and socially situated literacy practices. We are among the proponents of a competence-based approach to media and information literacy, as a middle path between the cognitive and cultural approaches. We consider media and information literacy as the expression of competence, manifest in one's competent-situated action. Competence is more than the mere mastery of knowledge and skills. It involves selecting and combining relevant knowledge and skills considered as internal resources to adapt oneself to novel situations in new and non-stereotypical ways. Defining media and information literacy as competence implies to consider it both as situated and accessible. Assessing media and information literacy as a competence means designing meaningful situations for students to engage and act in. In our research program, the combination of online information search and multimodal digital content creation was chosen as such meaningful activities for 3 reasons. First, both are potentially part of most adolescents' habitual media practices. Second, they could be combined into a single activity, creating a blog post based on the results of an extensive online search. And third, this integrated activity could be used to design novel complex tasks as part of our assessment instrument. Our work pursues 4 general research objectives related to media and information literacy competence assessment. First, we document the varying complexity of media and information literacy through different types of tasks. Tasks designed to evaluate competence should involve a contextualized activity with a meaningful motive. They should also require the selection and combination of various knowledge and skills. We seek to assess MIL through a complex task corresponding to a motive-oriented activity, creating a multimodal blog article based on the results of an extensive web search. Additionally, we use simplified tasks corresponding to some of the actions the complex task can be decomposed into, calling upon a limited subset of knowledge and skills that are required by the complex tasks. Second, we study the relationship between perceived MIL competence and measured MIL competence. We collect both performance-based measures of MIL and self-reported measures at the 2 levels of activities and actions as specified in Objective 1. Third, we examine how students' domestic and school-based media and information practices related to their MIL competence. Fourth, and finally, we examine how different factors affect students' ability to engage in the assessment tasks and hence the exercise of their MIL competence. These factors include the student's gender, the type of education they are enrolled in, or the socioeconomic index of their school. Within this general framework, the focus of this presentation is on Objectives 3 and 4, exploring the relationship between perceived levels of competence and practices, and the influence of gender on perceived competence and on practices.
The relationship between MIL competence and ME practices is a complex relationship. Many studies have highlighted how digital skills influence the breadth and depth of online engagement, and on how much content one produces online, even if only a minority of Internet users engage in production activities. Conversely, other studies have examined how online practices might support the development of male competence, yielding mixed results. On one hand, the use of digital technology does not guarantee either the development of skills beyond basic operational abilities or the quality and quantity of personal digital content production. On the other hand, a wide variety of online activities seem to support the development of information skills, just as varied media reception practices and more specialized production practices support media literacy competences. Several studies have looked at the relationship between gender and male competence or between gender and male practices. The results of these studies do not all point in the same direction. Regarding first male competences, some studies showed no difference between boys and girls in perceived or assessed competence in relation to information search or to digital content production, while other research found that girls were more competent than boys in all competence domains. Still, other studies found men to be significantly more competent than women in website creation. In contrast, girls reported being more skilled in evaluating search results. However, some of these gender gaps may have less to do with actual competence than with perceived competence, as women tend to rate themselves lower than men. Regarding now me practices, gendered differences are also the subject of diverging results. For example, in some studies, young men have been reported to have more diverse online information search practices and to engage in more digital creation practices like creating websites. But in a more recent study, women seem to use the internet more than young men for different activities, including creating different types of content. This recent evolution of practices may reflect some new trends that should be carefully watched in the coming years. Our protocol includes 2 data collection phases, but only the data of the first phase are discussed today in this presentation. In the first phase, a large sample of lower secondary education students aged between 13 and 15 years old completed a questionnaire on their self-assessed competence and self-reported practices relating to information search and multimedia creation. This first phase of data collection was completed in French-speaking Belgium in May 2019, with almost 2,000 students from 27 schools participating. While in the canton of Geneva, the first phase of data collection was completed in February 2020 with 600 students from 7 different schools participating. In the second data collection phase, which is, I repeat, not covered in this presentation, a smaller sample of the same age range completes a survey questionnaire and performs complex and simplified tasks. The data we report on in this presentation cover a subset of the items from our declarative survey. These items are grouped into 7 categories. Technical skills items ask participants whether they could perform 12 technical actions, such as bookmarking a web page. Information search competence items ask participants to what degree they felt comfortable finding answers to simple questions online or performing complex searches involving several websites, either for themselves or for school. Information search practice items ask how often participants engage in the same 4 types of online searches. Other information practice items ask how often participants engage in activities like following the news. Web creation competence items ask participants to what degree they felt comfortable creating an informative website for themselves or for school. Web creation practice items ask if participants had ever created such a website. Other creation practice items ask if participants had ever engaged in activities such as keeping their own blog. We now turn to the 5 research questions that we seek to answer through the analysis of this data.
First, we looked into the different levels of competence between information search and web creation activities. A series of non-parametric analyses of variance showed similar results for Belgian and Swiss students. In both regions, students reported significantly higher levels of competence for information search than for web creation. In Belgium, students also reported significantly higher levels of competence for simple information search than for complex search, which require them to gather information from several websites. In all cases, the difference between a given competence item for the school context and its equivalent for the personal context was never significant. Next, we looked into the different frequencies of practices between information search and web creation activities. Our analyses revealed that the majority of Belgian and Swiss students reported searching for information online at least once a week. The proportion of students who did so varied between close to 50% and over 80% depending on the type of search. By comparison, only a minority of students reported having created a website at least once in the past, with proportions varying from 9% to close to 21% depending on the context in which the website was created. A comparison of confidence intervals around the measured frequencies allowed us to rank the 6 practices in the following order, from most frequent to least frequent: simple personal search, simple school search, complex personal search, complex school search, personal web creation, and finally, school web creation. The order we found for the equivalent competence items is also apparent here, with the difference that each practice is always performed more frequently in the personal context than in the school context. Next, we looked into the correlations between information search competence, web creation competence, information search practices, web creation practices, other information practices, other creation practices, and technical skills using Kendall's-Tobey non-parametric coefficient. As each category corresponds to several survey items, each link we show in the following schema represents several correlation coefficients. A first observation shows that most of the coefficients between our item categories are low or even non-significant. There are 4 exceptions to this observation. The correlations between information search practices and other information practices, such as watching tutorials or consulting forums, range from weak to moderate with a ceiling of 0.39. The correlations between web creation competence and web creation practices range from weak to moderate with a ceiling of 0.31. The correlations between web creation competence and technical skills are all in the moderate range around 0.36. And finally, the correlations between web creation practices and other creation practices, such as keeping a blog or publishing tutorials, range from weak to strong with a ceiling of 0.58. Overall, there seems to be more connections between technical skills, web creation competence and practices and other creation practices than between technical skills, information search competence and practices and other information practices. Next, we turned to gender differences in reported competence. Once again, results proved to be similar in the Belgian and the Swiss sample. Boys reported mastering a significantly higher number of technical skills than girls. Boys also reported a higher level of competence for creating a website, both for school or for themselves. However, we found no significant difference in levels of reported competence between boys and girls for information search, be it simple or complex for school or for oneself. Finally, we looked for gender differences in our different practice categories. First, let's examine results for information search and web creation. Girls reported performing simple searches both for themselves and for school more frequently than boys did. Conversely, Belgian boys reported performing complex searches for themselves more frequently than Belgian girls did. No such difference for complex searches appeared in the Swiss sample. Belgian and Swiss boys also reported creating websites, in general for themselves and for school, more frequently than girls. Now let's turn to the other information and creation practices reported by our participants. In both samples, boys reported consulting online forums more frequently than girls. Belgian boys reported following the news more than girls, while the same difference was not significant in Switzerland. Boys also reported higher frequencies for 3 other creation practices, namely keeping a blog, creating video tutorials, and contributing to a web radio or podcast. For all other search and creation practices, no statistical difference was observed between boys and girls.
Now we discuss the most salient results and conclude by identifying some implications of our work for the development of male education practices. First, Belgian and Swiss students feel more competent at searching information online than at creating web contents. Web creation practices stay rare. Most young people are still more consumers than contributors, as shown by other studies. Second, the levels of perceived competence match the frequency of practices, especially for web creation, but much less or not at all for information search. Having created a website seems to influence the perceived competence to create one. However, engaging in other digital practices have less impact on web creation competence, probably because web creation competence comes with very specific practices and expertise. Third, information search competence and practices on the one hand and digital creation practices on the other appear relatively unrelated. Thus, the use of media does not guarantee the development of media competences. This finding is in line with other studies. Next, the students' school me practices are less frequent than their personal practices, both for search and creation. Nevertheless, it doesn't impact their perceived competence level, as our participants do not distinguish between their personal and school mail competence. These results should help understand how school can capitalize on the youth out-of-school practices and expertise, but also how school could support a diversification of me practices, as those competences are not currently developed at school. Finally, the number of technical skills that students master is mainly correlated with personal web creation competence. So, we wonder whether these technical skills are a prerequisite for creation practices, or if they develop through practice, or even both. The second phase of our research should give us some elements of response. We found some gendered differences in young people's practices and competence levels. Girls reported performing simple information searches more often than boys, and complex information searches for school as often as boys. By contrast, there were no statistically significant difference between boys and girls for simple and complex information search competence. The discrepancy between practices and self-perception of competence in simple information search can be explained either by the fact that girls tend to rate themselves lower than boys, or it's also possible that there is indeed no difference between boys and girls, as information search has become pervasive in teenagers' lives. In that case, marginal differences in practices might not translate in difference in competence anymore. Boys reported both creating websites more frequently than girls and feeling more competent at it. The frequency of boys' practices probably influenced the self-assessment of their creation competence. Finally, it is worth noting that also Belgium and Switzerland have different school systems. Results from our two samples converge to a very large extent. It means that the trends we present do not seem to depend on specificities of local education systems. So, what role should school play in developing MIL competences and ME practices? We are convinced that school needs to play a key role in the development of MIL competence and might also help reduce the gender gap in that domain, as these competences become a necessity in a digital world. It appears premature to formulate recommendations on how school systems may foster the development of MIL competence based on the limited results we presented. However, we expect that the second phase of the research, which includes combination of declarative questions, task-based MIL assessment, and qualitative interviews, will allow us to confirm our findings and bring new elements to our analysis. Thank you for your attention, and if you are interested by our research project and the next phase of our project, we invite you to follow us on ResearchGate.